Hey, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this conference and my talk. Today I will be sharing 10 tips with you how you can improve the validity of your experiments. Because did you know that more than half of the CRO specialists experience difficulty improving the value of running experiments to their stakeholders? There are of course several reasons for this, but an important aspect of running a successful testing program that is often overlooked is that the experimental design actually greatly influences the true impact that you can make. Whether an optimization program is successful, whether you have a positive business impact and your stakeholders are happy, depends on a couple of variables. The win rate is actually the most tricky one of them all, because the win rate also depends on a couple of factors. First, the quality of the website. If it's a crappy website, if you only started with optimization and you haven't run that many tests yet, then it is most of the time easier to find wins because it hasn't been optimized yet. But on the other hand, we're also talking about research and hypothesis-driven optimization. The more research you put into the process before you put a test live, the higher the chance that you will have a winning test, because you research what people actually want. And it sounds a bit funny, but if the experimental design and statistical knowledge is not up to standard, you run the risk of calling winners that are no winners in reality. So you promise your stakeholders added revenue, which you can't deliver. Or you don't recognize winning variations because of your test setup. So let me start with sharing the 10 tips to improve your experimental design of your testing program. The first one tip that I want to give you is that you need to determine if you have even a fair chance of finding a winner in your experiment. Do you have enough traffic and conversions in order to run an experiment? Otherwise, you will be wasting time and resources on your test that are never going to give you any insights or value. So in fancy terms, you need to determine the statistical power of your experiment beforehand. And statistical power is the chance that you will find an effect in your experiment when there is actually an effect to be detected. And it sounds a bit cryptical, but I'll try to explain this with an analogy. And this one is about fishing, because you can compare statistical power with your fishing technique. As you can see, mine is flawless. No, I'm kidding. Because we know that there are plenty of fish in the sea, right? And there are small ones and there are big ones. And you can compare that with the optimizations on your website. And there are enough optimizations on your website, some are big and some are smaller. The only thing we need is a good fishing net to catch those fish. And the thing is, if you don't put enough time and effort to make a good fishing net, like you're only testing on a very small amount of people, then you can only catch the biggest fish. In this case, only 30% of the fish, so this translates to a power of only 30%. But if you take more time to make a good fishing net, aka run the test on more people, put more time and effort into it, then you will catch more fish. So the chance that you will catch a fish increases by having a better setup experiment to 80%. And this is like the threshold that is used in most statistical research. So you need to build a fishing net that can catch at least 80% of the fish. And that, of course, then also depends on how many big fish there are in the sea. Because the bigger the fish, the bigger the improvements that can still be made. The less visitors you can have in your A/B test. But if there are only small fish in the sea, then you need very high samples. So that's what we need to determine first. And I've looked at all the winning experiments at VodafoneZiggo, that's the company that I work for, and it turned out that most winning tests make an impact on sales, or the main KPI, of less than 5%. A proportion is between 5 and 10%, but it's very rare to find really big fish, really big winners of more than 10 to 20%. So when you think of running a test, we first need to look if we have a fair chance to catch a fish of that 5%. So this is what we do before we start with even thinking about a test. We determine the weekly users and the weekly conversions. We determine how long the test needs to run for a significant result with a realistic, what they call minimum detectable effect. So you can use this spreadsheet. In this case, we can only detect a fish of 9.5% in 1 week of testing. And we know that most tests only make an impact of 5%. So in this case, we will run the test for 4 weeks. So we make sure that we can catch the smaller effects. Because if you do not do so and only run it for 1 week, then you have a very high chance that you just are wasting your resources on a test that's going to come back inconclusive. The second tip that I want to give you is to take sample pollution into account when designing an experiment. And sample pollution is what happens when visitors are seeing both variations during the experiment. And we are inclined to think that we can run a perfect scientific experiment online, but samples are getting more and more contaminated because people or browsers nowadays delete their cookies, or they visit the website on multiple browsers, or they visit on multiple devices. So we cannot recognize returning visitors that often anymore, which means that it becomes harder and harder to recognize returning visitors and serve them the variation they have seen before. And this all leads to samples getting contaminated with people who have seen both A and B, ABBA, and it becomes harder to find the true effect of your experiment. As we all know, there is no cure for this. Like we don't have any techniques how to recognize visitors over browsers, over devices, over multiple sessions. At least not for the majority of the visitors on the website. So what we need to do is take this into account when setting up an experiment. So on the one hand, you should try to limit the chance that visitors actually see a different variation in the second visit. And how you can accomplish that is that by running at least the test not longer than necessary, because the longer the test you run, the higher the chance that people return to the site with when they have deleted their cookies and they end up in the wrong variation. But you should also test on 100% of the traffic and with less variations. Because if people deleted their cookies and returned to the website, if you're only testing A versus B, then people still have a 50% chance of actually ending up in the right variation. And what you can do is look for pages which have like a lower chance of sample pollution, and those are mostly at the end of your funnel. Like people don't return that often to a checkout page, whereas on a home page people usually start the journey and then the pollution will be much higher there. So if you have the numbers, prioritize those tests that actually have a high session conversion rate. And that's all for limiting the pollution, but we also know that we cannot minimize the complete pollution. So what we need to do is also make sure that we can still recognize the effect, which is blurred into the whole results. So you need to test bigger changes to make sure that actually the effect you're measuring, that you can still recognize the effect. Like these two tips mainly focused on increasing the chance to find a winner. But if you have found a winner, does that mean then that you can start celebrating and going up on podia and shouting to your manager that you have found like an insane winner? Well, not right away, because significance doesn't actually equal validity. And what do I mean by that? Well, validity is the extent to which the results of your experiments are actually the result of the intended changes you made in a variant and not due to an uncontrolled other factor. Tip number 3 is to target the test as specific as possible. What I mean by that is that if you are testing something below default and looking at all visitors on the page as your test population isn't the way to go. For instance, we were planning an A/B test on the block at the bottom of this page with our contact details. And this block was shown on a lot of pages, so based on visitors, on the URLs, the test population was huge. But we know that only a very small proportion of those visitors actually scroll down to this block and see the change in the test variant. So in order to measure the impact of the change of this block, isolating the test population just on URL is not enough. So what we do in cases like this is that we measure the test population differently. We send a measurement to Google Analytics when the test element is in the viewport of the visitors. So you just saw this event added to the measurement. Here you can see that we actually fired A/B testing with the test itself. And this ensures that the effect that you find in your experiment can be related to the change in the variant and not to a different uncontrolled factor that's actually above your viewport, that something is going on there. So this really isolates your test population. Tip number 4 is to watch out and control for the so-called flickering effect. So this is the effect you see happening when the test code is being loaded, but you still shortly see the control, which you see here in the orange button where we change the content of the button. And this happens often when running client-side tests, like through Google Optimize, VWO, or Optimizely, where a JavaScript snippet is loaded on the page over the actual original page. The thing is that visitors could also notice flickering of content, which means that if this test is a winner, you don't know if the measured impact is due to the content change or due to the flickering, which might have attracted more attention to the tested element and therefore became a winner. So you need to limit this flickering to make sure that the measured effect is due to the intended changes and not due to the flickering. This can be accomplished by not using the drag and drop editors of your test tool. The drawback of using these editors is that they build up a unnecessary amount of code and mostly use jQuery, which actually slows down the page load. So write your test code in the code editors, or let your developer do that if you cannot do it yourself, and try to solve as much as possible just using CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, and only use jQuery if truly needed. Because jQuery makes use of an external library, and this needs to be loaded before you can apply the changes. In this example, you don't see any flickering in the orange buttons, because we made all the changes for the content just with CSS. So make sure that you prioritize your coding language and make sure that the actual load of your test isn't causing any big flickering effects. Tip number 5, do a thorough quality assurance before you put the test live. And this sounds like a no-brainer, but when we encounter problems with the validity of tests, the majority of the problems is due to lacking quality assurance. To show you the importance of the thorough quality assurance, I have an example of an A/B test we ran at Ziggo in the checkout. We wanted to chunk the layout of the page in smaller blocks so the form would actually feel less overwhelming, and we gave it a dark background to the blocks so they stand out more. And we checked the variation in various browsers and various devices, and nothing looked funny, so we put it live. But then, after a couple of days, we noticed that the variant was underperforming by a lot. And normally, of course, we didn't want to conclude anything because the test wasn't cooked yet, but it was a very stable trend and it was actually a very big decrease. So to find out what's causing this, if it was a true effect of the changes we made or some other uncontrolled factor, we did a deeper analysis in Google Analytics to find out what was going on. So we did a split of the results based on device, and on desktop no alarming drop was notable. This could still be due to chance, but the drop on mobile was actually more than 20%. So that was already a big there's probably something going on here, but still it could be that actually what we're testing is actually not going to work on mobile. But we found it suspicious, so we dove even deeper and looked at operating system. And this was a clear alarm bell, because iOS users didn't experience any trouble in the variant, but for Android users, something was clearly wrong. We noticed a drop of more than 80% for that group. So of course, we all took our mobiles and started checking the variant, and it turned out that it all looked well on Android, but when you actually started filling out the forms, something really strange happened. When you started filling out the postal code, the keypad appeared and immediately disappeared. So users actually couldn't fill out the form. So yeah, we checked all browsers on layout, but we didn't check if the functionality was still working. Even though we were only making changes in the layout, we still had to check if all the functionalities on the page were still working. So in the end, we fixed the bug and tested it again. And this time it was just inconclusive. So, but at least we were sure that the effect that we're measuring was actually because of the changes we made and not because of this stupid bug. So when QAing a test, it's not enough just to look at the variation through your preview functionality of your test tool. You should check the variation in all important browsers that your users are using, and not just how it looks, if the layout is okay, but also if all the events that are coming in, and if you can still proceed to the next page, or and even if you do something in the checkout, make sure that you can still make a booking. So yeah, make sure for a thorough quality assurance before you start your test. Number 6 is to be critical of your test results after the test is completed as well. To give an example, a few months ago we ran an A/B test where we removed the chat functionality from the checkout pages. And we did that because we saw in a lot of other tests on the checkout pages that if we made the checkout cleaner and actually removed all distractions, that basically all led to winning results. And this chat button was sticky on the page, so it was actually interfering with the interactions that you needed to do. So we ran this test and it was inconclusive. And of course that can happen, but we were like most tests with distraction removal did work, so what happened here? So what we wanted to do is check, okay, but we removed this chat component, so how many users actually were using it? Was it actually important? So I looked at the numbers of the number of times the chat was used. And what you see happening in this line is that the first 2 days we have events in variation A only about the chat and not in B, but after a couple of days we actually had the same amount of chats opened in the variant. And it turned out that there has been a release and the CSS selector on which we based the variant was changed in this release. So actually the chat component was still there. So in the end we just ran an AA test. It was successful as an AA test, but yeah, it was not actually what we were aiming for. So we needed to run this test again and make sure that the chat component was still gone for the whole testing period. So you need to keep in mind, the more unusual or interesting the data, the more likely they are the result of an error of one kind or another. So you need to be very wary of the results you're looking at and have a healthy sense of skepticism when you are looking at the results. This is also known as Timon's law. Tip number 7 is to check if your samples are truly random. Well, this is actually more important than you might think. At first glance, this test result looks very good. You measured an impact of 2.4% and a chance to beat of 92. However, you can also see that the variant had slightly less visitors than the control. So it could have been that due to technical issues with the test setup, that less new visitors were assigned to the variant. And as you well all know, returning visitors usually have a higher conversion rate than new visitors. In this case, like if you have returning visitors a conversion rate of 5% and new 1.8, then just because the composition of your group is different for the two test variants, then you measured this impact. But that was solely caused by the fact that relatively more returning visitors with a higher conversion rate were in the variant. The uplifts cannot be attributed to the visual change in the test. To make sure we look at random samples, we will always do a so-called SRM check. And this stands for sample ratio mismatch check. And this checks whether the sample rate is different than what you expected. So if you're running A/B test, you expect 50% in A and 50% in B. And by running this check, you can use it yourself here. It will tell you whether you have a mismatch or not. If you have a mismatch, then the real work starts. Because then you need to find out what went wrong. And most of the time it's something with the technical setup of your testing tool. For more information about that, you can check this article from Lucas Vermeer from booking.com, because he wrote a really nice article about that with all the things that could go wrong and what you can do about it. But important to keep in mind, if you encounter a sample rate mismatch, then you cannot conclude anything from those test results. So sadly, you need to throw them in the bin and make sure that you don't encounter any SRM errors. Tip number 8 is to do a thorough analysis, but don't overanalyze. What I mean is that we are inclined to slice and dice our test results when it doesn't reveal what we had expected or hoped for. Because of course we are looking for those winners and we were expecting that it was actually going to make us a lot of money. But it's very important that you set your hypothesis in advance and determine beforehand which analysis you want to run. Because if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. And I will show you. The problem is that as the number of comparisons increase, the chance of a false positive increases immensely as well. And this is known as the family-wise error rate or multiple comparison problem. If you're doing 7 analysis, like you want to look at the total results, split by device, split by user group, split by channel grouping, etc., then the false positive rate is no longer the 10% you are willing to risk when you're looking at 90% significance of a threshold, but actually a whopping 52.2%. So you will risk calling winners which aren't winners at all. What you need to do is to take into account this number of comparisons, because you do want to slice and dice sometimes, because you know that sometimes people react differently on desktop and on mobile. But in order to make those multiple comparisons in your test, you need to correct your p-value. So you need to be more critical when you call something a winner when you're making multiple comparisons. In this graph, I've used the CDAC procedure, but there are multiple procedures, but they basically do the same thing. And by using this correction, your critical p-value will be more strict the more comparisons you make, but the false positive rate will always stay at the same level. So you will still, even though you're making multiple comparisons, the false positive rate will stay at that 10%. So in case if you want to make 7 comparisons, you need to use a p-value of 0.015 instead of 0.1, which you can see is far more strict. But if you then find a winner, you will only have the risk of calling it a winner and not being a winner of 10% instead of 52%. The second to last tip to increase the validity of your testing program is try to limit human error. One way of limiting human error is by automating the analysis as much as possible. At Vodafone Ziggo, we automated the test analysis based on an integration with Google Analytics and Google BigQuery. The analyst now only has to fill out the test name, the dates, and the KPIs, and the tool will build up the segments and run the analysis in the background. And this prevents the CRO specialists, we have 15 analysts across the company, from doing the analysis all a bit differently or making small mistakes in the process. Another way is in standardizing processes and format. We have agreed on this format to showcase the results to our stakeholders. And our format looks like this. We have an executive summary slide. We have a slide with the test motivation and the hypothesis, one with the test setup. So when has the test run, on which pages, what did it look like? The quality assurance, so was it tested on all browsers and was the SRM check okay? You look at the main results, funnel statistics and some extra behavior on the page. And of course, if it's a winner, we calculate a business case and we end with conclusions and learnings and next actions. And this ensures that we all follow the same format, so we won't forget any important steps or that we cherry pick what we want to showcase to our stakeholders. Next to that, we introduced a peer review system. So all the analyses that are done are being shared with each other. So in the end, the quality of the analysis and insights from those experiments are improved massively. Yes, and the final tip is to really learn from each other. Because we are all doing experiments, but we are inclined to keep them to ourselves or only share it with our stakeholders. But if we share them with each other, then we can really learn and increase our win rate. At Vodafone Ziggo, all our experiments are stored in one central database. So we can easily retrieve test results and also find what others successfully or not successfully tested. And this improved the win rate amongst teams because we can learn from each other. And next to learning from what works, we also want to learn what doesn't work. And not only in experiments, but also in the things that are going wrong in the process. So next to a win board, we also have a fail board. And we feel that by embracing failure, analysts will easier admit and share their mistakes so that others can learn from it. And in the end, less and less errors are being made. And that results in trusting our results more and more. So, in conclusion, 10 tips to optimize your testing program are: determine the test power and sample size beforehand, so you're not wasting any resources on tests that won't give you any insights. Adjust your experimental design to limit for sample pollution. Target the experiment as specific as possible. Code your test in the code editor and limit the use of jQuery. And do a thorough quality assurance before the test goes live. Next, do a quality assurance after the results are in. Apply a healthy skepticism to the results you are seeing. And make sure you're looking at representative samples, so do the SRM check. Don't overanalyze and correct your p-value if you're doing multiple comparisons. And try to limit human error and really learn from each other. And when you take this all into account, I'm sure you will find more winners and have more faith in the winners that you find, which in the end will result in a very successful optimization program where your stakeholders don't question the value anymore. So, thank you all for listening, and please reach out if you have any questions for me. Bye!